Hey guys, it's Safina from Merch.com with a guide on how to merchant brand new items. It's a pretty difficult subject to make a guide about because each new item has its own unique place in the game, and I still want this guide to be useful in a year from now. This guide is not meant to tell you whether an item will rise or fall, as that information is worth a lot of profit, so don't bother asking me about that in the comments. I am on the other end always willing to discuss what kind of factors could initiate a rise or crash. I don't claim to always know, but I very rarely lost money on new items, so I should be able to help you in some way. So what is a guide for then, you might ask? I want to help you to decrease the risks that you take when you're trying to merchant new items. I'll explain this through various examples from the past and the future, which should also apply to future items, except then it will be up to you to evaluate the items based on the insights that I've given you here. To start this guide, let me make something very clear to you. There is no single strategy that works best that you can apply to each new item that comes out. Remember that if it was that simple, everyone would be doing it and there wouldn't be any need for this guide. Secondly, common sense stuff still applies for new items like not getting greedy, watching their price movements, and also simple things like how much you should put into them. For those who don't know yet or are still very stubborn, you should never put more than about 75% of your bank in one item. No matter how tempting it may be, you have to think of the long term. It is just taking unnecessary risks that will only get you stuck eventually or result in heavy losses. The more you can diversify, the better. Thirdly, the most important thing with new items is to understand how they fit into the game, and that is what most of this guide is going to be about. This is pretty complex, but I've made a checklist that you can quickly run over to help you understand the item better. Some of the questions are more important than the others, but it depends on the item. You can click on the questions here to skip to that part of the video if you need to. If you feel like I missed any, then let me know in the comments and we'll discuss it, and I'll be going over them now. So the first one, how long in advance did people know about this item? If the item comes completely out of the blue, there is a lot more uncertainty as there were no opinions, information, or market sentiment about it beforehand. If on the other hand players have known about it for quite a while, then you should already have more background info on what you might expect to happen when it is released. You can have a look at the RuneScape forums, the RuneScape Reddit, or some large friends or clan chats for this and see what people have to say about it. A good example to illustrate this are the level 85 weapons that will be released with player-owned ports next week and the ones dropped by the Wildy Worm next month. We've all known about them for a while, so we have an idea of at what kind of scale people will be moving to level 85 weapons from level 80 and 90 weapons. We know these updates will cause volatility in the level 80 and 90 weapon prices, so we best not have too much money in those right now until we get a chance to make profit on a rebound. Another example are the new treasure trial capes. People knew about the dice coming out, but not about these, resulting in a lot of uncertainty on what to expect about them. On the other hand, people already established beforehand that dice would be very rare and that you would not be able to remove them from gear, making them unattractive to actually use up, but giving them a way to get removed from the market, which would keep their value a bit higher. So look into how long people knew about the item beforehand and draw your conclusions from that. Ideally, you would already closely follow the item before it is released, so you are prepared for when it is there. If a new item is released that people knew was coming for 2 weeks and you have to start thinking about it and looking into it after release, then you're simply late and you're missing out on potential profit. If you do still try, then you'll likely get your ass kicked by people who did look into it beforehand, so it's best to be careful. The second question, how do you get the item and will people be willing to do that in the long run? This one matters really a lot. If the item is difficult to get, then you can expect attempts at people buying it out in the short term. Also, if Jagex made a mistake in how to get the item upon release, then any adjustment will cause panic, so you have to keep an eye on that as well. For that, you just have to look at what the drop rate seems to be like, and if that seems really wrong and a lot of people complain about it, then it might get adjusted. Now, it also matters whether people will be getting the item in the long term, even though initially that's not very important, but later on this starts playing a bigger role because it determines how much supply there will be in the long run, which affects the behavior of the item later on. Elder logs are a great example here. You can get about 150 per hour, which only profits you about 600 to 700k per hour at the time of making this video, and that is a very bad money making method compared to most other items that you can gather, like most other money-making methods, and you can thus assume that their volume isn't going to be spectacular unless bots come along. Demand on them isn't huge either, since you pay about 4 times as much for Elder Logs than for Magic Logs, while only getting 40% more XP. Another example are the new treasure trial items again. In the beginning, everyone was doing clues for them, but after a while, when they realized the rarity or because the price went down, people stopped farming clues specifically, and now only the occasional one from thieving or bossing gets done. And this means that for these items, the volume that enters the game is logarithmic, if you ever did any math, otherwise just look at the graph here, and thus they become easier to buy out for wealthy merchants later on, and when their price is dropped. A third example are nihil pouches. Camping nihils is about 4 to 5 mil profit per hour at the time of making this video, but the requirements to do so are very high, and thus the pouches can be around 100k each due to a low supply in their summoning secondaries. The third question, how does the item leave the game? Or does it leave the game at all nowadays? Because this is increasingly becoming an issue in the RS economy. A huge amount of items have no way to leave the game anymore because nobody ever loses stuff when they die. In the past, the amount of players in the game would grow enough to sustain new items, but that is no longer the case, and that means that in the long run, these items are destined to crash once the supply is larger than the average demand. The only way for the item to ever exit the game is if they drop below their high alt price, or if Jagex adds some alternative way. Drygors, for example, do not leave the game, and thus they have been crashing in the long run since their supply overtook demand. They will still have some rises when there are updates that make them good to have, like a new boss or a Slayer update, but for the rest they are bound to continue to go downhill at a very steady pace. Scrimshaws from player-owned ports, on the other hand, leave the game very often, especially when a lot of players want to go PVMing. People are willing to buy some of these scrimshaws for up to 2 mil each thus far, simply because their supply is low due to being consumable, and the demand is high despite them only giving a tiny bonus. The fourth question, what do people think of the MetGE price that Jagex has set? This one's related to number 2, which was about how well the items are being received by the players, basically. The difference here is that this isn't about what people think beforehand or how much they like the item itself, but just about what Jagex is saying it's worth. I personally know of extremely few items where Jagex got the MetGE price right upon release. Here are some examples of where that really went wrong. Now, you might say this is a chicken and egg problem where people simply make an item a different price than Jagex sets at first, but I believe it's simply because they really just don't know how players will be responding. So to deal with this, have a look around again and see what people would be willing to pay for something. Also look at how much the alternatives are worth in a Grand Exchange right now, as that matters a lot in what the price of the new item will become. If we look at the Elder Log example from earlier, Jagex set their starting price at 3k each, and if you can get 150 logs per hour, that is 450k cash per hour at 49k XP per hour, while cutting Ivy is more like 75k XP per hour. Magic logs were also about 1.8k each when Elder Logs were released, and they mostly entered the game through lots of boss drops. This is just very simple math and some easy insights to know that Elder Logs simply couldn't stay at that 3k each. While people may not be willing to pay over 4 or 5k each for them, few people are going to bother cutting them for less than that, so they're simply forced to stay at a higher price point. Then 5. Which items are directly related to it? I spoke about this in the second part of my short-term investing guide too, which you can read through the link here. The directly related items are those where one is required to create the other, and there are loads of examples like this, pretty much anywhere a gatherer and production skill meet. So a super ranging potion is directly related to Wine of Samarak and Dwarf Wheat, but also the Gramwell spikes. And the new level 85 whip will be directly related to Abyssal whips and so on. The reason why this matters is very simple. If one of the items rises, there is a decent chance that directly related items will too. So if a new item has items directly related to it, you must watch those two to better understand how the new item fits in. Then the sixth one, which items are indirectly related to it? I spoke about this in the same short-term investing guide. Indirectly related items are those that are indirectly linked in price, because if one of them moves a lot, then so will the others. Very obvious examples are, for example, the 3 Halloween masks, the party hats, the 6 Ascension keystones, Ascension crossbows, nihil pouches, but it also works across different tiers, like the seismic and Virtus ones, for example. If the seismic one rises, more people will be looking at Virtus ones too, waiting for them to rise or using them as a cheaper alternatives because seismics are too expensive for their liking now, or they don't want to risk losing money from a price crash. That's also possible. So the same advice as before, watch these indirectly related items as there is a decent chance they will influence each other's prices, and it's just important to understand how they all fit into the big picture. When people bought out explosive barrels, for example, sack of effigies and backstab capes started rising too as a result. If you paid attention to this, then you could have made some very easy profit. Then the seventh question, what updates could mess with the item in the near future? The chances of an alternative to the new item being released anytime soon is usually pretty small, as Jagex tends to spread out their content very wide. There are usually months in between stuff like new bosses, weapons, or specific skill updates. An exception to this, for example, are the level 85 melee and mage weapons from player-owned ports, and the next month again from the Willy Worm. Their close release dates decrease the impact the items could potentially have had if these updates were spread out further. Another example are the Holly Wreath and the Christmas Scythe and other discontinued items. If Jagex releases even more discontinued items with a small stock during Easter, then you'll see the value of all discontinued items take a serious hit as the money gets less concentrated again. Now, of course, we don't know if this is going to happen, but for a hoarder, it does make discontinued items dangerous to hold right now without knowing what exactly Jagex plans are for these continuous discontinued item additions, basically. Then the eighth question, which markets are people focusing on right now? Sometimes items simply enter the market at a very bad time. Just think of how right now everyone's focused on a bonus XP weekend that is coming up next month. Any item Jagex releases now will get less attention than it would have if there wasn't something major going on. If there are no interesting merchanting related updates coming up, then more people tend to focus on discontinued and treasure trial items since there just isn't that much going on with things like weapons and armors and resources. Now this was the case when the Christmas Scythe and the Holly Wreath were released. People were so immensely focused on those that not much else mattered to them, which opened up a lot more profit in other markets. Sometimes it can be a very good choice to not focus on the new items if you don't feel comfortable with them, but instead you can go to the markets that people are abandoning for new items, which open up a lot of opportunities for very easy profit. So if you ask yourself these 8 questions, you should be able to decrease some risk, but keep in mind that brand new items will always remain very risky because they're very competitive by nature. I hope that you enjoyed the guide, and if you made it thus far, I just want you to know you're pretty awesome. Take care guys, and I'll see you all again next week for another video.